Well, thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction. Thank you, Fraser, for the invitation to be here, and to all of you for sharing this discussion. As you'll probably be aware, some of the ideas I'd like to be sharing this morning I've sketched at in the Boyle lecture not so very long ago, and also in the chapter on spiritual intelligence as a concept in the book which is emerging from the projects that we've been engaged in. So, in a way, all I'm doing this morning is something of a riff on some of the themes from those texts, and perhaps pushing out a little bit further. And being somebody who has no claim whatever to any variety of scientific expertise, this will be very much the perspective of a theologian with philosophical pretensions, which is possibly the translation of public intellectual, Michael so kindly attributed to me. And as in one or two of the other things I've written and spoken about in this context, I want to begin just with a word about this notion of spirit itself, one of the most flexible, that is loose, analogically complex and diverse words that we use in relation to philosophy, theology, ethics, and a good deal more. But I would want perhaps to begin by boiling it down, dangerously, to two clusters of reference or interest. We use the language of spirit partly when we want to address ourselves to the unexplored and possibly unexplorable in the human repertoire, the unexplored and perhaps unexplorable, or at least that which is not finally explorable and discoverable. But we also use it as a shorthand for common agenda, common vision. Spirit is what connects. Spirit is the air we breathe, the climate we share. And that duality of meaning is one way into thinking about spiritual intelligence, one way, I think, of connecting the language of spirit with the language of ecology, which is the rather ambitious title I've given myself today. And spirit, you might say, is a fairly obvious metaphor in this context because of its primitive connection in all languages with breath. Now, when you think about breath, you see perhaps why those two meanings of spirit sit together. Breath is a motion from inside to outside and back again, to put it very, very simply, a motion from inside to outside and back again. In other words, it's something to do with the rhythm of embodied existence, but a rhythm which connects us with something inexhaustible that is not simply our immediate, tangible bodily existence. It's about something we can't help but be part of, but something we don't, in any sense, contain. We don't, in that sense, own our breath. The attempt to hold our breath for an indefinite amount of time is notoriously both difficult and dangerous. It lives in its moving, in its inside and outside dimension. And that's why it is, as I say, a very obvious vehicle for talking about certain things that the word spirit denotes and resonates with. So I'm working on the assumption that talking about spirit is talking about movement within a system. Movement in which barriers of inside and outside are more porous than we might first imagine. Movement which never settles in a contained way in any part of that system, which connects, moves, and transfers. A system, an active system, is a transfer of energy, and very specifically, a transfer of information. And indeed, it's hard enough to separate energy and information, as we all know. But in that sense, spirit, if it's seen as something that has to do with transfer and transformation within a system, is always already implicated in the very notion of intelligence. If we're talking about a system of energy that moves around, we're talking about a system in which, as I say, the barriers between insides and outsides are more porous than we expect. We're talking about that which relates us to what is not owned or limited, and yet which connects organic, embodied realities. And if we're talking about the commonalty, then we are talking about forms of intelligence. And that is why in the project that we've been sharing, the notion of spiritual intelligence has been such an interesting one to work with, simply because there's an element of that which is almost redundant. To talk spirit and to talk of intelligence, they belong together. And that, of course, takes us to one of the paradoxes of this area of discourse, which I'd sum up rather boldly by saying, so the physical is actually the spiritual. That's to say, any account of embodied reality which takes seriously the exchange of information and energy in such a way that the participants in that exchange are transformed by it, any such physical exchange corresponds to, satisfies the definition of requirements of being in some sense spiritual, in some sense intelligent. I come back repeatedly to the fact that some kinds of mechanist views of the world talk blithely about the exchange of information as if information were a set of little particles transferable from one container to another, rather than triggers for response, which require, as you might say, a sympathetic audience. The exchange of information assumes an intelligent recipient and a formally coherent input. And when you're talking about that, you are talking about something which is already on the frontiers of the spiritual. I think here of a wonderfully mischievous and provocative discussion by my friend and former student Orion Edgar in his lovely book on Merleau-Ponty, where he talks about eating as a form of intelligence. Because, of course, eating is the way of absorbing information. No surprise, perhaps, that in scripture and elsewhere, eating books is a metaphor that comes back very frequently. And the nourishment one gets from books and the very familiar medieval image of ruminating the scriptures. All of that reminds us that it's not such a strange metaphor after all, but quite literally, says Orion Edgar, eating is an information exchange. Certain things are absorbed into an organism which transform that organism. Certain triggers are provided and the codes are recognized, and a coherent and fully formed response occurs. I eat so that my metabolism is changed by that. And that is an exchange of information. When one thinks of eating as a metaphor for intelligence, or breathing as a metaphor for intelligence, or all of that as caught up within this whole general picture of what spirit might mean, that's not too difficult to see why the identification of the spiritual with the physical is less absurd than at first sight might be suggested. But it also reminds us of some of those aspects of embodied and organic intelligence which are frequently screened out of discussion in the ways we speak about intelligence, artificial and otherwise. We may say that a computational system digests information. We don't, on the whole, see computers having breakfast. We may say that computers and other sorts of system non-organic system may be terminated. They don't die. And I imagine, I don't know, interesting to find out, but they're worried about dying. See what I mean? That remarkable fiction by Ishiguro, Clara and the Sun, which many of you have read, is, I think, a very good thought experiment in helping us imagine what the consciousness of termination might be for a non-organic system. And I think Ishiguro pushes it as far as it will go there, but in so doing also helps us to see quite what will and what won't work in that respect. And the recognition of that broad physicality and organic physicality of intelligence and the exchange of intelligence, that I think should at least prompt us to go on asking some slightly awkward questions about what kinds of sense-based and organic-based information are necessarily and inevitably screened out in most models of artificial computational intelligence. And certainly ought to make us even more cautious about assuming that the model we have of intelligence in that context can, so to speak, be retrojected onto the way human intelligence works, so that we implicitly screen out certain kinds of organically based knowledge, acquaintance with our world, which don't fit into those models. I'm delighted to see Iain here this morning, and I don't need to underline the way in which his work has foregrounded the sorts of intelligence that are, to use an ugly word, disprivileged by the way in which we privilege certain models of information exchange, ruling out the informational process and the transformational process connected with those other embodied sensual forms of knowing. We end up, of course, producing more or less successful simulacra of those other forms of knowing if we worry about them at all in the AI setting. We can't easily, if at all, model the specific sets of triggers and recipient mechanisms that are proper to individual subjects. We can't easily model how input is received in the inner ecologies of memory and self-narrative. So the fact that certain sounds, certain sights, not to mention certain smells, among the most difficult things to imagine being modelled in non-organic systems, trigger different kinds of information, different kinds of responsiveness in organic, specific beings. So we may, if we're conscientious modern academics, issue trigger warnings at the beginnings of classes about Jane Austen or Beatrix Potter, but we won't know precisely what individual nightmares will be resurrected by Jemima Puddleduck or Persuasion. In that sense, there's clearly a dimension in which we can say, as I hinted in the article on spiritual intelligence that I drafted, a sense in which spiritual intelligence is energy describable as what shapes bodies as bodies, rather than simply random clusters of responsiveness. Our capacity to connect information received, to narrate a series of responses in a coherent and consistent way. All of that, I think, is part of what makes us talk about bodies rather than simply lumps of bone and fat. And another issue which preoccupies me quite a bit from the theologian with philosophical pretensions angle is how it is we come to talk about bodies at all, as if it was self-evident what a body is. Because a body, as what one philosopher of the 20th century called a 0 point of orientation. A body is a position within a system, and the mapping of that position, including the specific capacities inherent in organically occupying that position rather than others, mapping of that is how we begin to understand what a body is as a unit, as a point of orientation, and therefore a point of intelligence and intelligent exchange. So, thus far, I've been trying to think out loud about, first of all, the definition of spirit in a way which allows us to think about it as closely bound up with systems of coherent exchange, but also systems of coherent exchange which allow us to imagine and recognize what we don't know, what is beyond our containing capacity. And there are mischievous suggestion that the physical and the spiritual belong together, insofar as physical exchange is part of what we mean by spirit, transfer or shaped intellectual energy. And to move on to the second word in my title, ecology. I've touched on that already very briefly in terms of what I call the inner ecology of our own memory, the way we narrate ourselves. And it seems to me that the ecological dimension of using a word like spirit has to do with precisely how intelligence recognizes and negotiates this locatedness of specific organic realities within a system. To understand oneself ecologically is to understand oneself as an element in an oikos, a meaningful oikos, an oikos with a logos to it. That is a habitat, which is what the word oikos means, a home, a habitat within which we have to devise coherent strategies for moving, using, avoiding, absorbing, etc. What not to bump into, what to eat and not to eat, how to move up and down, how to calculate distance, all of these fundamental aspects of embodied intelligence, and all are thinking about our connectedness of our environment, therefore comes into that sense of the life of spirit as inherently ecological, to do with mapping in a coherent way, logos, the habitat, the oikos, in which we find ourselves. You might say that the basic question of intelligence is not so much who am I as where am I? What's the point in the system of exchange at which I begin to orient myself? Hence the primitive point of orientation definition that I took from the 20th century philosopher I quoted earlier, who incidentally is Edith Stein, Husserl's pupil, who later became a Carmelite nun and went to Auschwitz, as many people know. Where am I? Where am I in relation to the systems of information exchange in my material environment, but also where am I in relation to the narrative and the memory that's at work within? I think that takes us right back to the start. Spirit is about the unexplored or unexplorable. It's about what internally and externally I know has to be questioned, negotiated, interrogated all the time, but which, in principle, I will never come to the end of, because the very act of exploring and interrogating gives me new material for exploring and interrogating. At the same time, it's a task which, because we are linguistic intelligences, a task which brings me back repeatedly to that exchange with other 0 points of orientation, other elements within the exchange capable of dealing linguistically with me. And there's more that could be said about that, about the range of what we mean by language here, the, I think, necessarily and helpfully fuzzy edges of the notion of language that we have to work with, which allows us to talk about language in non-human organisms and in some rather stretched senses, the language in which the entire environment speaks to us. And always, I have to say, very wary about giving a talk in a room with windows looking out onto such remarkably intelligent input coming in, which will engage and trigger a great deal in those of you who are losing patience with the speaker. They need to receive intelligence from elsewhere, but that's not a matter. But I think you may see what I mean here, that what I call the ecological dimension of spirit, that sense of our intelligence working on where we are and returning to that question, locates us not only in respect of our material environment, but in respect of that complex of inscribed recollection, which our brains continually work on, which we call, in shorthand, memory. The Oriental notion of karma is one of the most stupidly abused and misunderstood notions, I think, in the entire world of philosophy and religion. Karma as fate or something like that is the way in which so many people pick it up. Karma as a kind of determinism in vulgarized sub-Hindu systems. I say sub-Hindu, meaning the sort of people who've read a couple of books by Indians and think they understand Hinduism. Karma is about inner ecology. Karma is about the fact that what has happened to me and what I have made to happen around me continues to have a heavy imprint on my capacity, the rhythm and nature of my response, and the possibilities that I can take for granted where I am. It's a manifestly sensible and rather sophisticated account of how to come to terms with where I am. Not a determinism, not a system which is simply predicated on paying off the debts I've incurred, but a recognition that where I am and thus who I am are imprinted. At no point do we start with complete tabula rasa. And although that's, of course, come to the fore most sophisticatedly in most detail in Oriental religious systems, anybody who's ever read Augustine's Confessions will know that it's not entirely strange to the Western Christian tradition either. And Book 10 of Augustine's Confessions, a text to which I return almost obsessively, as generations of my students will confirm. Book 10 of the Confessions is, for its time, a truly remarkable account of memory in terms of what we can and can't know, what we can know that we don't know, the paradoxes of knowing that we do not know some specific piece of information, but we can't access it. What Augustine calls the caverns of the memory. Augustine, I think, is the first philosopher actually to identify the "it's on the tip of my tongue" phenomenon. Oh, you remember that philosopher who wrote, what's the book? I know it as well as I know my own name. Augustine's the first person to analyze that phenomenon in human behavior, because he sees our memory, our intelligence, as a deposit of imprint, access to which is complex. Let's also put it in complex, and not just available at will. And his long analysis in Confessions 10 of those phenomena, I think, helps us to see a little bit of why he himself says memory is spirit. It doesn't mean that spirit is simply identical with our acts of remembering, but he sees the whole life of spirit as bound up with that complex process of negotiating the imprint that we So it's another way of approaching the "where am I?" question. And in terms of the ecological adjustment of this point of orientation, this embodied point of orientation to the wider world, we have, of course, again in both Eastern and Western religious traditions, ample schemes of spelling out how our systematic attunement to the patterns of the world around is enhanced by, made possible by, and feeding back into our sense of ourselves as coherent moral agents. The connection in classical Greek Christian spirituality between praktiki and physiki, theoria, practical contemplation, natural contemplation, a sense of oneself as a coherent moral agent and a sense of the coherence of the intelligible world go together. And moving through those, one becomes more capable of a theoretic or theological apprehension of the infinite. That is the contemplation of that which is systematically inaccessible to the finite mind. And so once again, in thinking of the ecological dimension of spirit, we can return to issues around our reflections on artificial intelligence with perhaps some new questions and new interrogations, new points of entry into the complexity of this. We can recognize, I think, that where I am can, in a very large number of respects, be simulated with high levels of success, high levels of sophistication. And we need then to have a clearer sense of what that range will cover, as well as what it won't. We need to recognize that the simulation of our physical locatedness is something which can be, I think, very successfully modeled, simulated, reissued, recreated in artificial terms, and that includes also rule-governed forms of physical behavior. That's why computers make chess games. Whether, to use an example I've often used before, whether computers can solve cryptic crosswords remains to me an interesting question, simply because the solution of cryptic crosswords requires a whole range of senses of our embeddedness and localized reality, our cultural and linguistic reality, which is very hard indeed to reduce to algorithmic form. But pressing on some of those issues is simply going to give us a sense not of panic about the capacities of AI exceeding human capacities, but I would hope a sense of, quite simply, problems that are sensibly soluble in these terms and problems that aren't. Issues that have to do with, as I say, broadly, rule-governed patterns of behavior, where a kind of consensual model emerges without too much problem. What unlikely course of action, a likely prediction would look like. And those areas where the interaction of external context and what I call internal imprint is, I think, probably conceptually resistant to some of those ideas of algorithmic binary modeling. And when it comes to it, I guess that what I would say to the journalistic query about whether I'm panicking about AI is that the panic is nothing much to do with AI. The panic is to do with the extraordinary eagerness of so many of us to accept a dramatically mythological version of what AI can do, which reflects back on our own intelligence in a way that is trivializing and restricting. That's the real worry. Not what AI is going to do with us, but what we are going to do with it in locking more and more doors for our imagination. Or, to use the ugly word again, disprivileging those aspects of our embodied intelligence that don't fit into models like that. So that, to refer to a very familiar paradox, our supposedly materialistic age becomes less and less materialist in any positive and sensible sense, in that we are more and more ignoring, failing to understand, forms of intelligence that are bound up with our embodiedness. We make less and less of those things. And that's also a cultural, sometimes even a class issue, as well as an abstractly intellectual one. We know that there's one way of knowing, and it's this way. It's the way I'm comfortable with. And that's pretty dangerous, I think, in any kind of social setting. And it's pretty corrosive in any sort of healthy spiritual response to the world we're in. And I needn't, I think, underline the fact that that is part of what causes ecological crisis. Granular accounts of problems in our negotiation with the world which fail to see that environments are systems in which apparently small elements have disproportionately large roles to play because they all carry a distinctive kind of intelligence, a distinctive kind of information. And the rather unexpected results, sometimes introducing alien life forms into new geographical settings, whether it's cane toads in Australia or whatever else it may be, simply demonstrate our unwillingness to understand the interlocking nature of ecological information exchange, and ultimately therefore suggests a real spiritual illiteracy about the world we're in, which plays out as scientific illiteracy. Back to my earlier point about the physical and the spiritual converging, I would extend that a little bit and say that the spiritual and the scientific, in the proper sense, ought to be convergent in just that way, recognizing the almost unimaginable complexity of interlocking information systems, and therefore being extremely cautious about those hubristic attempts to suppose that the reduction of these to localized, granular, algorithmic problems would in fact deeply destabilize that exchange that we're part of. So I won't have told you anything very new or extraordinary here. As I said, I just wanted to offer a brief riff on some of the reflections that I've been tackling in recent bits of thinking and writing. Hope that this may provoke some response, disagreement, maybe even constructive contribution to taking it further forward. I present it to you simply as work in progress somewhere in here and out here too. And look forward very much to what you have to say about it. Thank you for listening patiently.
Great, thanks so much. Now to respond, we're going to have Mark. So Mark started with a degree in physics, degree in theology, another degree in theology. Works as a psychotherapist, has been at the Maudsley, now in private practice, got ordained with the Church of England en route, was ordained for a number of years, but is probably best known as a writer and a broadcaster. Has a wonderfully rich, ongoing series of interviews, conversations with Ruth Sheldrake. Has written incomparably the best guide to Dante, the Divine Comedy I've ever read, by a very long way. I recommended it to my sister, admittedly she gave up on to one, but it's a really good and has a wonderful book also out of this project already, one of the first big outputs on spiritual intelligence. So, Mark, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rowan, and it's a joy to be able to respond. And if I could just riff very briefly and maybe amplify or say the same sorts of things in a way from the perspective actually of some of my guides like Dante and William Blake and others, because when you were talking their poetic way of putting things. Perhaps it's another way of opening up this spiritual intelligence, which of course you'll know about. Starting off with Plato, and when you were talking about not just asking who we are, but where we are, this feels like a central concern of the ancient Greeks, and it reminded me of the beginning of the Phaedrus, the dialogue where they have a long discussion about walking along the river, and Socrates says, "Oh, we can't sit here, it's far too busy with spirits." And they move a little further along, and then Plato says, "Well, there's a strange myth associated with this bend in the river, isn't it?" And eventually they find the right kind of place to then remember what love might be. And of course, that links to your thoughts about memory and the spirit as well, that all true knowledge and intelligence is a kind of recollection in Plato. But where you are and who you are, all this must come together and create a kind of virtuous spiral that enables you then to share, to participate in that which the philosophy might reveal. I'm just trying to remember quite where I can remember, but there's a lovely bit where Plato also talks about pneuma and these links between wind, breath, and spirit. And he describes, forgive my slightly journalistic way of putting this, but the sort of the intake of the wind that through your breath becomes part of your living spirit, but then that your spirit breathes out and so returns that through your breath to the wind as well. And seeing that process is rather wonderful with in relation to the connecting things you were saying. William Blake, a couple of his well-known phrases came to mind as you were talking that I hope adds a little bit another way of putting it, really. When you were talking about the links between body and spirit, Blake, who in one moment can be very critical of the empirical philosophy of Locke and others, of course, but his point really is that if you just take this kind of empiricism, this dead materialism, as you were alluding to at the end, it just leaves you passive in relation to the world. And he absolutely loathes that. And so he has these wonderful phrases like, "How do you know but that every bird which cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight enclosed by the senses five?" And if you just leave it, as it were, enclosed by the senses five and don't actively engage, as he puts it, don't just sort of look at the window, as you were suggesting, but you look through the window. And that's what the senses can give us, opening up this immense world of delight. But that requires our activity. And maybe that is close to what we were talking about, this mix of desire and intelligence as well. Then, linking into the ecological points too, our relationship to that world around. This quatrain is one which I think you could probably, meditate on all your life from Blake, when he says, and if you forgive the gendered language, but nonetheless he says, "He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise." And that kissing the joy as it flies, learning how to participate in that rather than this rather possessive binding which destroys life. He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. So there's Blake on my mind as you were speaking. Just to give a moment for Dante as well. The whole Divine Comedy actually could be read as a kind of reflection on what spiritual intelligence might be. That's a bit of a plug for my session on Friday morning. But just one thing, again, this communicating spirit. Actually, I just reviewed a book on the Divine Comedy by Dennis Turner. So I must give the credit where credit's due, because he really highlights this point about how in the Paradise, many of Dante's preoccupations, like smiles, like music, like light, are these symbols that both manifest in the world, but their manifestation is also a communication of that where they come from. So it's a linking of the finite and the infinite. And so it's both at once an engagement with that which we can sort of absorb, we can cope with, like for Dante, Beatrice's smile, but she constantly has to sort of titrate the quality of her smile to him. Because if she sort of smiled too much, too early, it would sort of blast him, and he couldn't take it in, he couldn't participate with it. So there's something there about the education of the smile, the education of music, the education of light. When you were talking about eating and nourishment, it struck me, there's lots of these words where we can use them in physical ways, but in the richer ways, of course, they're saying a whole lot more beside. And then just finally, you mentioned the imagination at the end there as well, and of course, the mind goes to Coleridge's famous remark about the imagination, and how so important it is to realise that mere fantasy is not at all the same as this kind of sharing in the divine imagination, which is a co-creation, and again, so brings all that we might be and are in a participation that is at once sort of expansive, but not in a consumptive way, but maybe in a contemplative way, as you were alluding to as well, because it's to share in the divine life that we're already, as it were, moving through. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Which response to what we were talking about. Do you want to respond to that or go? No, would you first?
Yeah. A couple of things very quickly. Thanks so much, Mark, for that. Two things coming to mind. Blake first, and another Blakean quatrain. The atoms of Democritus and Newton's particles of light, as sands upon the Red Sea shore, where Israel's tents do shine so bright. Amazing quatrain, but I think partly Blake saying that there's some sort of continuity between the particles of light and that covenanted community of imagination and poetic hope and justice that's imagined on the Red Sea shore there, and putting certain kinds of theory politely but gently in their place, sands on the shore. Fascinating. But the other thing, perhaps rather more substantive, to do with Beatrice's smile, a little bit with Plato as well. It does seem to me very important that there are certain things worth knowing that are only knowable over a certain period of appropriate time. And another aspect of our contemporary intellectual muddle is that we're very reluctant to think of how and why knowing takes an appropriate amount of time. It's another dimension of Iain's work, which I very much appreciate. We were talking about this at Teon Y just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, the time-bound nature, or not time-bound, but time-rooted nature of certain sorts of knowledge. To know this means taking the time to learn it. And you do not learn it without taking that time. And that's Beatrice's smile in a sense. You can't do it all at once, because it's not reducible in that way. And that seems to me to reflect very, very closely on the embodied, localized nature of our knowing. Because bodies take time, that's what they do. As we speak, we are getting older. And you may feel that listening to a talk like this has made you get a lot older rather quickly. Another half hour of my life, I'm not going to get back, as they say. But we are, as embodied beings, that kind of knower. And Dante's rather good at that.